He stood still, surrounded by silence. The blade in his hand caught the last light of dusk, a frail glint against the looming shadow of Versailles. Robert-François Damiens, a man of no renown, held his breath as the weight of a kingdom pressed against his chest. His target was not merely a man, but a myth, Louis XV, heir to the Sun King, the untouchable heart of France. One thrust could rewrite history. One misstep could unravel it. The blade slipped, grazing flesh instead of piercing it, and in that moment, Damiens did not run. The man who dared to wound a king would pay a price no ordinary death could satisfy. His fate was not a swift blade or a quiet poison. It was to be torn apart by horses, limb from limb, before a crowd that would never forget the cost of touching the divine. The air was heavy that January evening in 1757. Paris churned with the scent of frost and unrest, its streets alive with whispers of hunger and betrayal. Damiens, a former soldier turned servant, had lingered too long in the wrong places, taverns where men cursed the crown, churches where priests murmured of divine discontent. Versailles glittered like a distant star, but beneath its chandeliers the kingdom rotted. Taxes crushed the poor, wars bled the treasury dry, and the king's indifference was a wound deeper than any Damiens could inflict. His penknife, small and unremarkable, was no assassin's dagger, yet its intent was monumental. He struck at twilight as Louis stepped from his carriage. The guards were sluggish, the moment fleeting. A shallow cut, a cry, and Damiens stood unresisting as the world closed in. The crowd did not gasp for the king's blood, but for the audacity of a commoner who dared to defy the untouchable. The palace became a theater of rage. Louis, barely scratched, retreated to his chambers, his pride bleeding more than his body. The court demanded vengeance not for the injury, but for the insult. To strike a king was to strike the divine order, or so they proclaimed. Damiens was no romantic assassin, no shadow trained in stealth. He was a man broken by a world that knelt to one man's whim. His trial was a formality cloaked in velvet and fury. The judges' voices were ice, their verdict cold or death, by quartering a punishment so ancient it seemed plucked from myth. 4 horses, 4 ropes, 1 body to be sundered. The Place de Grève would be the stage and all of Paris the audience. Why such cruelty for a failed attempt? Why not a noose, a blade, a quiet end? The answer lay not in Damiens' act, but in what he represented. A king's power was not in his crown, but in the fear he inspired. A single man armed with a penknife in desperation had shaken that fear. To let him die quietly would admit fragility. His death had to be a spectacle, a warning etched into the memory of every soul who dreamed of rebellion. But how did a man so ordinary come to challenge a king so divine? To understand the death of Damiens, we must first understand the world that forged him, a France where loyalty was a chain and defiance a sentence of unimaginable horror. Damiens was not born to die in pieces. He came into the world in Arras, a northern town where the wind carried the chill of survival. His father toiled in fields and workshops, his mother a shadow worn thin by too many children and too few hopes. Young Robert was no scholar, no soldier at first, just a boy with eyes that saw too much. France in the 1720s was a land of stark contrasts, golden palaces for the few, mud and hunger for the many. Damiens learned early that words were cheap, but bread was costly. As a servant in noble houses, he polished boots and overheard whispers of discontent. In those halls, he saw lords feast on pheasant while peasants starved. He heard priests preach patience while living in comfort. The seeds of his rage were sown not in a single moment, but in a lifetime of watching power devour the powerless. By his 20s, Damiens had drifted into the army, then out again, a restless soul in a restless time. He was no hero, no visionary, just a man carrying the weight of a kingdom's wrongs. In taverns, he listened to men who spoke of justice, of a France where kings served the people, not the other way around. These were dangerous words, but they burned in him like a fever. He worked in noble households close enough to power to see its cracks. The Jesuits, with their fiery sermons, spoke of a king who had lost God's favor. Pamphlets passed in secret called Louis a tyrant cloaked in silk. Damiens absorbed it all, his mind, a crucible where anger and duty fused into something deadly. He was not a leader, not an orator, but a man who could no longer bear the silence. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1756, France was bleeding from wars it could not afford. The 7 Years' War had begun, and the king's coffers were empty. Taxes rose, bread vanished, and the people's patience frayed. Damiens, now in his 40s, found himself in Paris, a city teetering on the edge of revolt. His penknife was no weapon of war but a tool of desperation. He did not plan to kill Louis outright. Some say he meant only to wound to send a message. But messages to kings are rarely received with grace. As he stood in the twilight of January 5th, 1757, blade in hand, he believed he was striking for something larger than himself. He was wrong. He was striking at a machine that would crush him without pause. The court of Louis XV was a world of mirrors reflecting only what the powerful wished to see. The king, once a symbol of hope, had become a figure of apathy. He hunted, he dined, he loved, while France starved. His ministers whispered of reforms, but their words were drowned by the clink of gold and the rustle of silk. Damiens' act, however small, was a crack in the mirror, a reminder that even a king could bleed. The court's response was not justice, but theater. The judges, cloaked in black, spoke of treason, of sacrilege, as if Damiens had stabbed the heavens themselves. They sentenced him to a death so brutal, it belonged to an age of barbarians, not enlightenment. The crowd would watch not out of loyalty, but out of fear and fascination. A commoner had struck a king and paid with his body, but the kingdom itself was beginning to bleed. In the weeks before his execution, Damiens was no longer a man, but a symbol. The court's fury was a performance, a way to drown out the whispers of dissent that echoed beyond Versailles. They tortured him first, not for answers, but for show. Hot iron seared his flesh, yet he spoke little, his silence louder than his screams. The interrogators asked why he dared to strike the king. His answers were vague, muddled by pain and defiance. He spoke of hunger, of injustice, of a France that no longer knelt blindly. But the court heard only treason. They wanted a confession, to parade a story, to justify the spectacle to come. Damiens gave them nothing they could use. His silence was his last rebellion, a refusal to let his pain become their script. As the day of execution neared, Paris buzzed with a grim anticipation. The Place de Grève was prepared, a stage for a tragedy no one could look away from. The crowd gathered not out of hatred for Damiens, but out of a hunger for something, justice, vengeance, or simply a break from their own suffering. The ropes were measured, the horse had restless. Damiens was brought forth, his body already broken, but his eyes still burning. The court wanted a lesson. He would give them a nightmare. And as the first rope tightened, the question hung in the air like a blade. Could a man's death silence a kingdom's anger, or would it only fan the flames? The morning of March 28, 1757 was cold, the sky in a dull gray over the Place de Grève. Damiens was brought in chains, his body marked by weeks of torment. The crowd was a sea of faces, merchants, beggars, nobles, all drawn to witness the king's wrath. The executioners were not mere men, but actors in a grim play, their tools, the ropes and horses that would tear a man apart. The order came not with a shout, but with a whisper. The king's justice must be seen. Damiens was bound, each limb tied to a horse, each rope a promise of agony. He did not beg. He did not cry out. His silence was a weight the crowd could feel, heavier than the stones beneath their feet. The horses pulled and the world held its breath. But the human body is stubborn, its sinews stronger than the court's patience. The ropes strained, the horses snorted, and Damiens endured. The crowd murmured, some in horror, some in awe. The executioners, frustrated, resorted to blades cutting into his flesh to aid the horse's work. Blood stained the square, but Damiens' voice remained silent. His eyes, witnesses said, never left the sky. It was not the clean death of a martyr or the swift end of a traitor. It was a ritual sacrifice to a king who needed fear more than loyalty. As the final rope snapped his body apart, the crowd did not cheer. They watched frozen as the cost of defiance was carved into their memory. He died slowly, like a candle burning out in a storm. The executioners gathered what remained, and the pyre was lit. The flames consumed what the horses left behind, but they could not burn away the whispers. Damiens was gone, but his act lingered, a wound in the king's myth, a crack in the divine facade. The court declared victory, but their triumph was hollow. In the silence of the square, as the ashes settled, something shifted. The crowd dispersed, but they carried his story home, a story of a man who dared and paid the ultimate price. The Place de Grève was empty by dusk, but Paris was not silent. Whispers spread through taverns and alleys, tales of a man who faced 4 horses and did not break. Damiens had died, but his defiance lived, a spark in a kingdom dry with discontent. The court returned to its mirrors, but the reflection was no longer flawless. Louis XV resumed his feast, his hunts, but the shadow of that penknife lingered. The nobles who watched the execution spoke of it in hushed tones, not of justice, but of fear. A commoner had struck a king and paid with his body, but the kingdom itself was beginning to bleed. In the years that followed, the whispers grew louder. The hunger deepened, the wars dragged on, and the crown's grip weakened. Damiens was no hero, no leader of men, but his act was a warning, a pebble that starts an avalanche. The French Revolution was still decades away, but its seeds were sown in moments like these, in the blood of men like Damiens, who dared to say no. His name faded, but his story did not. Pamphlets retold his tale not as a villain, but as a man who saw what others refused to see, a king who ruled not by divine right, but by fear. Centuries later, his death remains a wound in history's memory, not because he succeeded, but because he tried. Not because he was torn apart, but because he stood still. In the silence of that January dusk, with a penknife in his hand, Damiens became more than a man. He became a question: what is the price of defying power? The answer was written in blood and fire in the Place de Grève, where a kingdom's cruelty revealed its own fragility. And as the flames died, as the crowd turned away, they carried that question with them into a future where kings would fall. Damiens had been a common man, but his defiance echoed through the years, a shadow that haunted a monarchy that was doomed by its own fear. The court had done all it could to erase him, but the memory of Robert-François Damiens could not be buried. Even after his death, the whispers of his courage spread. In the streets of Paris, in the taverns, in market stalls, people spoke of him not as a failed assassin, but as a man who had dared to speak the unspeakable. He had been punished beyond measure, but in doing so, the court had given him an eternal place in history. Every year that passed only added to the weight of his defiance, turning him into a symbol of the people's anger and frustration, a martyr for the poor, and a warning to the powerful. Damiens' legacy, though fleeting in his time, grew stronger with the years. He became a symbol of the oppressed, a figure whose defiance transcended his death. His act, though unsuccessful in killing the king, sparked a fire in the hearts of those who lived under the weight of an indifferent monarchy. The streets of Paris were alive with murmurs of revolt. The court had thought they could extinguish Damiens' rebellion with violence, but instead they had fed the flame. In taverns, on street corners, and in quiet rooms, the whispers of his defiance grew louder, urging others to rise against their own chains. And yet the monarchy carried on its leaders, believing the bloodshed had silenced all opposition. Louis XV, despite the cracks in his kingdom, still held tightly to his power, blind to the storm that was brewing beneath his feet. But the people had seen something different. They had seen that even kings could bleed. Damiens, though forgotten by many in official circles, became an icon among the masses. His name lived on in pamphlets, songs, and hushed conversations, a testament to the idea that even the most powerless could challenge the mightiest forces. His death, while brutal, was not in vain. It ignited a spirit that could not be quenched. The echoes of his defiance resonated far beyond his death. Decades later, as France teetered on the brink of revolution, his memory was invoked by those who called for change. In the faces of the revolutionaries, one could almost see the shadow of Damiens, the man who dared to wound the divine and paid the ultimate price. The storm that Damiens had sparked eventually became a tempest. The revolution, once a distant possibility, was now an inevitable force, and in it, the stories of those like Damiens were revived. He became a martyr for the cause, a figure whose act of defiance laid the foundation for a world where kings no longer reigned unchecked. The memory of his execution was a bitter reminder of the lengths to which the monarchy would go to maintain control. Yet as the revolution gained momentum, the very system that had condemned Damiens began to crumble. The people had tasted rebellion, and they would never return to the silence of their former oppression. Damiens had struck with nothing more than a penknife, yet his defiance was greater than any weapon. His courage, in its simplest and most desperate form, became an enduring symbol for the masses, proof that even the most insignificant among them could make an impact that echoed across history. Though he died in agony, his sacrifice was not forgotten. It lived on in the words of the revolutionaries, in the banners they carried, and in the blood that would soon flow in the streets of Paris. Damiens had shown them the price of defiance, but also the power of standing firm, no matter the cost. As the revolution unfolded, Damiens' name became synonymous with the will to challenge tyranny. Though his death had been violent and cruel, it had forced people to confront the fragility of power. Kings, nobles, and the elite could not hide behind their wealth and privilege forever. The revolution would unmask them all. With each passing year, Damien's story grew more than just a tale of tragedy. It became a beacon for those yearning for justice. His life, though short and marked by hardship, proved that sometimes even the most broken of men could strike a blow for something greater than themselves. As the French Revolution unfolded, those who had once lived in fear now stood tall, inspired by the very memory of Damiens. The king's reign, once thought unassailable, began to crack and crumble as the people realized that their power, though long suppressed, was never truly gone. Damiens, in his quiet rebellion, had done what no noble could. He had dared to challenge the divine order, to remind the people that they were not powerless. His name became a rallying cry for those who dreamed of a world where kings were no longer feared, but questioned. The revolution was not just about the fall of a monarchy, it was the birth of a new world. A world where the powerless were no longer voiceless. A world where Damien's act of defiance became a symbol for every commoner who dared to rise up against tyranny, no matter how small or insignificant they seemed. In the years that followed, Damiens became an enigma. To some, he was a hero, a martyr who gave everything for a cause greater than himself. To others, he was a tragic fool who had failed in his quest for justice. But to the people who had risen in revolt, he was a symbol of unyielding resistance. As the revolution reached its peak, the people remembered Damien's defiance every time they raised their voices against the crown. His story became woven into the very fabric of their struggle. He was no longer a mere man, but a legend, one who had struck a blow for freedom, however imperfect. In the streets of Paris, people sang songs of his courage. They spoke of the man who dared to wound a king with nothing more than a penknife, and in doing so made history. The revolutionaries carried his story in their hearts, pushing them to fight for a future where no one would ever again be silenced. Though Damiens had died in a brutal and public spectacle, his death had sparked something unstoppable. The monarchy could no longer protect itself from the people's wrath. The courts, once so quick to punish dissent, were now irrelevant in the face of the revolution's fury. The wheels of history had been set in motion long before Damien ever stood in Versailles with his penknife. His act had been the spark igniting a fire that burned through France. It was a fire that would eventually consume the old order, leaving behind a new world, one forged by the people's courage. Even after his death, Damien's legacy remained a question in the minds of the rulers. Could any monarch ever truly hold power if one man, a commoner, could challenge them so boldly? The answer was clear in the years that followed. The age of unchecked royal power was drawing to a close. As the revolution unfolded, Damien's name echoed through the halls of power. The once feared monarchy now trembled in the face of a new force, people who had tasted the power of defiance. The seeds Damiens planted grew into a force that could not be silenced by violence or fear. In the chaos of the revolution, the people rose not just to tear down the old regime, but to rebuild a world where they no longer lived in the shadows. Damiens had shown them that even the most broken and humble among them could make an indelible mark on history. The fear that had once kept the common people in line began to dissipate. The court, which had tried to quash Damien's rebellion with violence, was now faced with the realization that their power was no longer absolute. The whispers of defiance had grown too loud to ignore, and they could no longer silence them. Damiens, in his silent sacrifice, had changed the world in ways that no one could have predicted. His name became synonymous with resistance, not just against the king, but against the very idea of tyranny itself. He had given the people a voice that would soon shout from the rooftops. The revolution that followed Damien's death was a violent, tumultuous time, but it was also a time of immense hope. For the first time, the people of France believed that they had the power to shape their own destiny, that their voices could no longer be ignored or crushed beneath the weight of royalty. In the years after the revolution, Damiens was remembered as more than just a symbol of rebellion. He became a martyr in the eyes of the people, a reminder that the struggle for justice could start with a single defiant act. His sacrifice was not in vain, it inspired generations to come. His defiance, though tragic, became a rallying cry for those who believed in the power of the people. It was a reminder that no matter how entrenched the system, one person could change the course of history. Damien's act was a spark, and the revolution was the fire it ignited. The French monarchy fell, but the memory of Damiens lived on. His death, though violent and cruel, had led to the downfall of an empire that thought itself invincible. The revolution proved that even the strongest powers could be overthrown when the people stood united in their desire for change. Damiens had never sought fame or glory. He had only wanted to send a message, and in doing so, he changed the world. His story was retold again and again, not as a tale of failure, but as one of courage and defiance. He had struck at the heart of tyranny, and his legacy endured. As time passed, the story of Damiens became a symbol of the eternal fight against oppression. His name was invoked in revolutions far beyond France's borders, a testament to the power of individual resistance. Though his life was short and brutal, it had sparked a movement that would resonate throughout history. Damiens' legacy became more than just a moment in history. It became a belief that even the smallest acts of defiance could bring about profound change. His story was passed down through generations as a reminder that the power of the people once awakened could never be truly extinguished. As France rebuilt itself in the wake of the revolution, the name of Robert-François Damiens was never far from the minds of those who fought for justice. His defiance was woven into the fabric of the new nation, a symbol that even the most humble could stand against the mighty. The revolutionaries who had overthrown the old regime did not forget the lessons of Damiens. They had seen how one man armed only with a penknife, in desperation, could challenge the divine right of kings. It became a central truth in the new world they were forging. All men are equal, and no one is above the law. Though the monarchy fell and the revolution changed the landscape of France forever, Damiens' story endured as a testament to the strength of the human spirit. His act of defiance had cracked the foundation of a kingdom that had once been thought indestructible, and in doing so, he had helped bring about a new era. The years that followed saw the rise of new leaders, new ideas, and new challenges. But the memory of Damiens remained a constant, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, a single act of courage could alter the course of history. His legacy lived on not in monuments or statues, but in the hearts of the people. Damiens' name, though often forgotten in official history, continued to inspire revolutions and movements around the world. His simple act of defiance showed that power is not eternal, that even kings are vulnerable to the will of the people when they refuse to be silenced. As new generations rose, the story of Damiens was retold not as a mere footnote in the history of France, but as a lesson in the potency of resistance. His fate was harsh, but it proved that standing against injustice, no matter the cost, was worth the struggle. The people of France, shaped by the events that followed Damiens' death, began to see themselves not as subjects of a king, but as citizens of a nation. His act had shattered the illusion of divine right and replaced it with the reality that power must be earned, not inherited. For those who followed in Damiens' footsteps, the revolution became not just an event in history, but a living, breathing force, something to be carried forward into every struggle, every fight for freedom. His name became synonymous with the power of the individual against the forces of oppression. As the years passed, the monarchy was but a distant memory, but Damiens' story remained a reminder of what had been and what had been overcome. His defiance, his sacrifice continued to echo through the streets of Paris, in the hearts of those who would never forget the price of standing up for what is right. In the final years of the monarchy's legacy, Damiens was seen less as a villain and more as a tragic hero. His death had brought the world into focus. No matter how high a man's station, he could be touched by the anger and resistance of the masses. The revolutionaries, though many years removed from Damiens' death, viewed him as a precursor to their own struggle. His solitary act had been the spark that set off a fire. They often invoked his name, a reminder that even the smallest act of rebellion can have great consequences. Through every revolution and every fight for freedom, Damiens' spirit was present. His was a legacy that spoke of sacrifice for the greater good, a legacy of standing firm against the oppressive weight of an unjust system, no matter how impossible the fight seemed. As the new world emerged from the ashes of the old regime, the memory of Robert-François Damiens remained etched in the minds of those who sought justice. His name was whispered in revolutionary circles, a symbol of the power that one person could wield in defiance of centuries of corruption. The cost of defiance, as Damiens had shown, was high, but the reward for those who followed was the creation of a world where no person was beyond reproach. His death had been gruesome, but it paved the way for the birth of a new France, one shaped by the dreams of the common people. As time went on, the ideals Damiens had unwittingly helped inspire began to take root across the world. His name, though not famous in the conventional sense, became a symbol of quiet defiance and the relentless pursuit of justice, especially in times when it seemed impossible. In the post-revolutionary era, Damiens' story was often shared in classrooms, within revolutionary texts, and in the speeches of those who fought for liberty. He was a reminder that the fight for freedom was not just about armies and battles, but about the courage of an individual standing against oppression. Though centuries passed, the idea that one person could change the course of history remained strong. Damiens had proven that, with nothing but his courage and a simple knife, he could challenge the might of kings. His legacy was more than a single act. It was the spirit of resistance that never fades. His story reminded the world that power does not rest solely in the hands of those who sit on thrones, but in the hearts and actions of those who dare to stand up against it. Damiens had shown that even the smallest of actions could send ripples through the fabric of society. In every struggle for justice that followed, whether on the streets of Paris or in the distant corners of the world, Damiens' spirit lived on. His story was a testament to the enduring belief that when people stand united, they can shake the foundations of even the most powerful systems. As the world entered new ages of change, Damiens' story persisted in the hearts of those who fought against tyranny. His act of rebellion, though humble, became the cornerstone of every revolution that sought to break free from the chains of authority and injustice. Damiens had shown that resistance wasn't about grand gestures or weapons of war, but about the courage to take action when everything seemed hopeless. His death served as a reminder that the smallest spark could ignite a revolution, setting off a wave of change that could reshape history. In the years following the revolution, political leaders often used Damiens' story to highlight the dangers of ignoring the people's will. His fate was a lesson to the rulers who thought they were invincible, that no matter how high they rose, they were still vulnerable to the voice of the oppressed. The bloodshed of the revolution had faded, but Damiens' sacrifice was not forgotten. His name continued to inspire every movement that sought justice, from labor unions to civil rights groups. His legacy lived on as the embodiment of the ordinary man's power to challenge extraordinary forces. Damiens had never intended to be a martyr, but in his defiance he had become one. His name was spoken not in condemnation but in reverence. Every time someone stood against tyranny, his spirit seemed to rise again, a reminder that the fight for freedom was eternal. Damiens' story became a timeless parable for those who fought for the underdog. The lessons of his courage continued to resonate, urging those who felt powerless to take action and make their voices heard. His act, small yet mighty, demonstrated that change begins with defiance. As the world evolved, Damiens' legacy endured through the struggles of future generations. His name was invoked during protests, uprisings, and movements across continents, symbolizing the enduring battle against injustice. His story lived on as a touchstone for all who believed in the power of resistance. Even as political landscapes shifted and new leaders emerged, the core lesson of Damiens' life remained unchanged, that true power lies not in wealth, titles, or military might, but in the courage to stand up against what is wrong, no matter the cost. Though he paid with his life, Robert-François Damiens had succeeded in his ultimate goal. He had made a mark on history that no amount of power could erase. His legacy was a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, willing to fight for justice, even when faced with overwhelming odds. The world that followed was shaped by many influences, but in the heart of revolutionaries and those who yearned for justice, Damiens remained a symbol of defiance. His quiet yet powerful stand against tyranny had sparked a fire that would continue to burn for generations to come.